Winter, 1886, Bitter Creek, Montana. The stagecoach stopped beneath a gray sky, and from its shadows stepped a woman with trembling hands and eyes too tired for her age. Snow clung to the hem of her dress like the past refusing to let go. Her name was Evelyn Mae Carter, a mail-order bride who carried her whole world in one worn suitcase and a heart that didn't quite believe in kindness anymore. The wind smelled of smoke and old leather. Somewhere in the distance, a horse snorted restless, waiting. She could have turned back then, if there had been anywhere left to turn, but when the barn door swung open and the tall figure of a man appeared against the fading light, she froze. His hat brim hid his eyes, but his voice cut through the cold like fire through paper. "Darlin, I don't bite unless you ask me to." The silence that followed was heavier than the snow itself. Two strangers, both marked by things they had rather forget, now standing on the edge of something neither had words for. And if stories like this of old wounds and quiet redemption find a place somewhere in your chest, stay a while longer, subscribe, so you don't miss when we ride back into Bitter Creek and light the fire again. The last stagecoach of the season rattled down Bitter Creek Road, its wheels carving narrow scars through the white. The wind blew hard from the north, howling through the canyons like something half alive, half lonely. When the coach stopped, the horses snorted clouds of steam, their flanks shining wet beneath a fading sun. A woman stepped down. Her boots sank an inch into the snow. She didn't move for a moment, just stood there, letting the cold bite her fingers clean through her gloves. A few strands of hair slipped from her bonnet, catching the light before the wind took them. Her name was Evelyn Mae Carter, though no one here knew it yet. To them, she was only the bride from back east, the one a man had paid for in coins and promises. She held a small wooden trunk, scuffed and cracked at the corners. Inside, 3 plain dresses, a faded photograph of her mother, and a brown leather journal bound with twine. She carried it the way some folks carry a weapon close to the chest, ready for the world to forget her name again. Behind her, the driver tipped his hat, muttered something about a storm coming, and turned the horses back toward the town they'd left a half-mile behind. The wheels creaked once more, then faded into nothing but wind. Evelyn started walking. The snow squeaked beneath her boots, every breath leaving a ghost that drifted behind. In the distance, a figure stood near a fence post, tall against the gray horizon, coat collar turned high. She didn't wave, neither did he. The house beyond him was small, crouched low against the cold one-porch light, glowing faintly through the snow. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a thin, stubborn line. Evelyn stopped when she was close enough to see his face. His jaw was rough with stubble, his skin marked by sun and wind, eyes hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat. For a moment, she thought she'd stepped into someone else's story, because this man didn't look like the one in the photograph folded in her pocket. The man shifted his weight, boots crunching on ice. Then, quietly, he said, "You, Evelyn Carter." She nodded once. The wind caught her voice before it could form a word. He looked at her trunk, then back at her. The corner of his mouth lifted just a fraction. "Darlin, I don't bite unless you ask me to." It wasn't a smile, not really. More like a weary man remembering how to sound human. For a heartbeat, she wanted to run back to the coach, to the road, to anywhere but this frozen patch of land. But her feet stayed, maybe from pride, maybe from exhaustion. Or maybe because the way he said it, soft, not cruel, made her wonder if beneath the roughness there was something else. He took the trunk from her hands without asking. His gloves brushed her fingers, and she felt how warm he was, how real. "Storm'll hit by nightfall," he said. "House ain't far." Evelyn followed him down a narrow path where the snow came up past her ankles. He didn't look back to see if she kept pace, but he slowed his steps just enough that she did. The path wound between fences half buried in frost, past a corral where 2 horses huddled close. One lifted its head and whinnied, as if sensing the stranger among them. The smell of hay, leather, and smoke hung in the air, familiar and foreign all at once. Inside her, something loosened. Not trust, not yet, but the tiniest space where fear could breathe. They reached the porch. The boards creaked under their weight. He opened the door, the hinges groaning like an old man waking from a nap. Warm air met her face, thick with the scent of pine wood and coffee long gone cold. He set the trunk beside the stairs, turned to her, and nodded toward the small room down the hall. "Bedroom's yours. There's a lock inside. Use it if you need." Evelyn glanced past him. The room was plain wooden bed, quilt folded neat, a single candle burning low. She couldn't remember the last time anyone offered her a choice, let alone safety. "I'll see to the horses," he added, already reaching for his coat. She hesitated, wanted to thank him, but the words stuck somewhere between her throat and the ache behind her ribs. When he stepped back into the cold, she finally closed the door. The wind outside pressed against the windows, whispering, testing. She lit the candle higher, the flame trembling. Then she took out her journal, the leather stiff from travel. Her handwriting shook as she wrote, "He didn't touch me. He didn't ask questions, just carried my bag and walked beside me in silence." Maybe that's what mercy looks like out here. A floorboard creaked. Evelyn froze, her breath caught. The doorknob turned slow, careful. She reached for the inkwell like a weapon. The door opened just enough for him to slide in a folded blanket and a cup of warm water. "Gets colder after midnight," he said. "Didn't want you catching frost." Then he left, the door closing with a soft click. Evelyn stared at the blanket, at the faint steam rising from the cup. The candlelight flickered across the walls, painting the room in shades of amber and quiet. Outside, the storm gathered its breath. Inside, something else began. A silence no longer filled with fear, but with the sound of a heart remembering how to wait. And that was how she arrived at Bitter Creek alone, afraid, and maybe, just maybe, one step closer to finding warmth again. The night hadn't yet lifted when Evelyn heard him moving about the yard, the crunch of boots on frost, the faint clink of metal, steady, measured, unhurried. She stood behind the window curtain, fingers tracing the cold glass, watching the shadow of a man who didn't seem to feel the cold at all. Elijah Ward. That was his name. The letters had been printed neatly at the bottom of every letter she'd received, but letters never carried the smell of smoke and leather, nor the quiet heaviness that hung around him like a coat. He walked toward the corral, shoulders broad beneath his worn jacket, and the wind caught the ends of his scarf. For a moment she saw the pale scar along his jaw, gleaming faintly where the morning light touched it. Folks at the station had spoken of that scar, and of the man behind it. They said he'd once drawn his gun faster than his own shadow, and that the price of that skill had been blood. They said he'd been married once, two, until the winter she left him without a word. Evelyn had laughed when she heard it. A story like that couldn't be true, but now, seeing him from behind this fogged window, she wasn't sure she wanted to know whether it was. He turned then, maybe sensing her eyes, and the air between them went still. For an instant, it was just the wind and the distance of a few feet that felt like miles. Elijah tipped his hat slightly, the motion simple, respectful. "Mornin'," he said, voice rough from sleep and years of dust. Evelyn didn't answer. She only nodded, her throat too tight for sound. He didn't seem to mind. He went back to feeding the horses, moving slow, careful, as if every motion was a conversation he'd had too many times before. When she stepped out onto the porch a little later, the air burned her lungs. Frost glittered on the railings like shards of glass. Elijah was stacking hay bales by the barn, his breath a steady rhythm of smoke in the cold. "You don't have to help," he said without looking up. "Ain't much to do, 'cept get used to the quiet." Evelyn watched his hands broad, scarred, gentle with the horses. She wanted to ask about the woman who'd left him, about the scar, about why the man in her photograph had softer eyes. But all she managed was, "The quiet's loud out here." He looked at her then, one eyebrow lifting. "You'll get used to it. It's honest sound. Doesn't lie to you like people do." A long silence followed, the kind that didn't hurt, not yet. just settled in the air like dust. Inside, the fire had gone low. She knelt by the hearth, feeding it wood one piece at a time, feeling the warmth crawl back into the room. On the table lay one of his letters, creased and yellow at the folds. The ink had bled a little from moisture, but the words were still there. I'm not much for talk, but I can offer steadiness, a roof, and land that won't run away from you. It wasn't poetry, but in a world that had taken too much from her, steadiness sounded close enough to hope. By noon, the snow began again. Heavy flakes drifted past the window, each one catching on the air like feathers too tired to fall. Elijah came in, brushing snow from his hat. He looked around the room, as if making sure she'd found her footing here. Hope the room's fine, he said. Didn't know what color folks from the east fancy. All I had was pine. It's warm, she answered, voice barely above a whisper. That's enough. He nodded, set his gloves on the table. The silence stretched again. She could hear the ticking of a pocket watch somewhere, the slow heartbeat of time that refused to hurry. She wanted to ask him what had happened before she came, why the letters had felt so much gentler than the man himself, but something in his stillness warned her not to. Some wounds, she thought, only opened when called by name. He poured himself coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the cold room. When he noticed her watching, he poured another and set it on the table near her hand. Careful, he murmured, hot. Their fingers brushed, just barely. The kind of touch that could have been nothing or everything. She sipped. It was bitter, but real. The heat spread through her chest, chasing the cold back a little. Outside, the storm picked up. Wind rattled the shutters like bones. Elijah leaned against the doorframe, eyes half on the horizon, half somewhere far away. Sometimes, he said, the wind sounds like people you used to know. You'll think they're calling your name, but it's just the cold playing tricks. Evelyn looked up from her cup, and if it's not, he turned his head slowly, and for the first time, she saw his eyes gray, steady, and tired in a way that didn't come from sleepless nights alone. Then you answer, he said softly, but you don't step outside till morning. They both smiled, faint, unsure, like people who hadn't practiced it in years. Evening came early in Bitter Creek. The world outside turned the color of smoke. Elijah lit the oil lamp, the flame flickering between them. He checked the door latch twice before hanging his hat by the stove. She sat near the fire, journal open on her lap, pen trembling in her hand. The page stayed blank longer than she meant it to. Finally, she wrote, "He's not the man from the photograph." Maybe that's a mercy. Elijah's chair creaked as he sat across from her. For a moment, it felt almost like peace. The storm still howled outside, but inside there was warmth, and the faint sound of wood shifting in the heat. When she looked up, he was staring into the fire, lost somewhere deep behind that scar. Why did she leave, she asked before she could stop herself. He didn't move, didn't flinch, only said, "Some folks can't stand quiet, makes them hear themselves too clear," and that was all. Evelyn lowered her eyes, closing the journal, fingers resting on the soft leather. The room was silent again, but different now, not empty, just waiting. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind's voice gentler, almost kind. Inside, two strangers shared the same flicker of light, learning the shape of silence together. The morning after the storm, the world was nothing but white and the sound of snow giving way under their boots. Elijah walked ahead, steps steady, shoulders squared against the cold. Evelyn followed 3 paces behind, not because he'd asked her to, but because she didn't yet know how to walk beside him. The space between them felt safer than closeness, and she needed safe more than she needed warmth. He didn't speak, not once, only turned, every now and then, to make sure she hadn't fallen behind. When she stumbled on a patch of ice, he stopped, extended his hand halfway, then drew it back when she steadied herself. The air smelled of pine resin and horses. Somewhere far off, a coyote cried, the sound thin as thread in the wind. Evelyn lifted her chin, the cold burning her lungs. Each breath felt like proof that she was still alive. Elijah led her down a narrow path between snow-laden trees. The trail wound along a frozen creek, the ice cracked in long gray veins beneath their feet. She could see his breath clouding the air before her, fading slow, like the rhythm of someone who had learned to wait. He carried her trunk easily, the weight of it balanced in one gloved hand. When she tried to reach for it, he shook his head without looking back. "Got it," he said. Just that. They passed a split-rail fence half buried in snow. A crow perched there, black against white, watching. Evelyn pulled her coat tighter, fingers numb. In her chest, her heartbeat kept time with the crunch of their steps. For miles, there was only the sound of wind and wood groaning under frost. The world felt emptied of color, and she wondered if it would ever return. Then she saw the smoke thin and rising from the chimney of a cabin set against the foothills. A single light glowed in the window. Elijah stopped. "That's home," he said quietly. Home. The word didn't fit in her mouth. She tasted it, like something she hadn't eaten in years. He glanced over his shoulder. "It ain't much, but it's dry." Evelyn nodded. Her lips were too cold to form words anyway. As they drew closer, she noticed small things fences mended with care, a porch swept clean despite the snow, a rope of dried herbs hanging beside the door. Details that didn't belong to a man who'd stopped trying. Elijah set her trunk down just inside the doorway, dusting snow from his coat. "There's stew left from last night," he said. "Ain't fancy, but it's food." Evelyn stood in the threshold, unsure whether to enter. The room smelled of smoke and pine tar, with a faint hint of soap. She could hear the faint tick of a clock somewhere, the slow heartbeat of a house that didn't mind being alone. He noticed her hesitation, rubbed a hand along the back of his neck. "You can have the room at the end. There's a lock on the inside." The way he said it, it wasn't apology. It was permission. She stepped in, her boots dripping onto the floorboards. He took off his hat, placed it on a hook, and for the first time she saw his face clearly in the light. The scar along his jaw caught the glow of the fire, silver like the edge of a blade. His eyes weren't cruel, just old. Older than the man in her letters. Older than the years he'd lived. He poured stew into a bowl, slid it toward her across the table. "Eat while it's hot." Evelyn sat, the chair creaking beneath her. The stew was thick with beans and something smoky bacon. Maybe. She didn't look up as she ate. He didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. Just wide, like the land itself. When she finished, she whispered, "Thank you." Elijah nodded once, as if the word had weight. "Long road from the east," he said. "You'll sleep deep tonight." She wanted to ask how he knew, but then, she thought, maybe everyone who came this far carried the same kind of tired. He left her alone then, retreating to the porch. She heard him lighting a cigarette, the scratch of a match in the wind. Smoke drifted through the open crack of the door. It smelled like the evenings her father used to sit by the barn, before the fire took everything. She closed her eyes, letting the memory ache and fade. Later, when she went to her room, she found a blanket folded at the foot of the bed, coarse but clean, a small pitcher of water on the table. No words, no note, just quiet thoughtfulness, the kind that didn't expect gratitude. She sat on the edge of the bed, unbuttoned her boots, her fingers stiff. From her coat pocket, she pulled the small leather journal and placed it on her lap. The cover was warm from her body heat, the pages stiff with cold. She wrote, "He walks like someone who's carrying ghosts, but he never lets them touch me." The candle flickered, light pooling across the floor, beyond the window. Elijah's shadow moved slowly along the porch, back and forth, checking the latch, then still. He was keeping watch, though she doubted he'd call it that. When she blew out the candle, darkness folded over her gentle as a quilt. Outside, the wind sighed through the valley. Somewhere in that sound, she thought she heard the faint scrape of boots on snow, his, not leaving, just pacing the length of the porch, steady as a heartbeat. And for the first time since leaving home, she didn't dream of running. The valley slept under a sheet of white that winter. Snow lay heavy on the birch trees, bending their thin arms toward the earth. Smoke rose from Elijah Ward's chimney, a narrow gray ribbon disappearing into the sky. The house stood alone in the hollow, a single lantern burning by the porch, as if it too was trying to stay awake through the night. Evelyn followed him through the door, her boots leaving small, melting prints across the floorboards. The air inside was warm, but still, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and horsehair, and something else quiet, the kind of quiet that held its breath. Elijah set her trunk beside the wall, brushed the snow from his shoulders, then nodded down the hallway. "That room at the end," he said, voice low, steady. "It's yours. There's a lock inside. Nobody's going to bother you." His eyes didn't stay on her long. They drifted toward the window, where the light was dying behind the ridge. Evelyn gave a small nod. Words felt strange in her mouth, as though she'd forgotten how to use them. She walked down the narrow hall, the floor creaking softly under each step. The door he'd shown her opened into a small room, a single bed, a quilt folded neatly, and a wash basin that smelled faintly of soap and cold iron. She set her coat on the chair, ran her hand along the windowsill. The glass was thin, rimmed with frost that caught the glow of the lamp like silver threads. Outside, the wind moved through the valley in long, lonely sighs. For a while, she just stood there, listening to the house breathe. Every sound the pop of firewood. The groan of wood in the cold felt alive. She sat on the edge of the bed, unclasped her hands, and looked at the tiny ink stain on her thumb. From her trunk, she pulled the leather journal, opened it to a blank page. The nib of her pen hovered, but didn't move. Down the hall, she heard Elijah moving boots against wood, a faint clatter of metal as he banked the fire. He wasn't a man who filled the silence. His quiet was different, solid, like earth under snow. When the house finally went still, she blew out her lamp and lay back, eyes open to the dark. But the dark here wasn't cruel. It was soft, humming faintly with life beyond the walls. Sometime past midnight, a sound stirred her, a slow turn of the doorknob. She froze, breath caught halfway. The pen fell from her fingers, landing on the blanket with a muffled thud. The door opened just an inch, then his voice came, low as the wind. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. He stepped just far enough to place something on the floor beside her bed, a folded wool blanket and a cup that steamed faintly in the dark. "Night's dropping colder than I thought. Figured you might need this." He didn't wait for an answer, just nodded, almost to himself, and turned back toward the hall. "Thank you," she whispered, but the word was too small to reach him. When the door closed, she reached down and touched the cup. The metal was warm, the handle smooth from use. She lifted it, took a careful sip water with a trace of honey, still warm from his hands. For a long while, she sat there, the blanket across her knees, staring at the place where the light from his lantern had spilled under the door and faded away. The air still held the faintest scent of tobacco and pine. She picked up her pen and in the journal wrote slowly, her script uneven in the lamplight. "He didn't touch me, didn't even look long, just didn't want me cold." The ink bled a little where her hand trembled. She closed the book, pressing her palm against its cover as if to steady her own heartbeat. Outside, the wind rose, brushing against the walls like a hand searching for warmth. She listened to it until her eyes grew heavy, her body sinking into the bed's soft gave. When sleep finally came, it was thin but dreamless. At dawn, she woke to the sound of boots on the porch again. That same steady rhythm she'd come to recognize, the sound of a man who had nowhere else to be, and stayed because that was the right thing to do. Through the frosted window, she saw him leading a horse out toward the pasture. The sky behind him was streaked with pale pink and gray, the kind of morning light that didn't promise warmth, only endurance. She stood there for a long moment, watching. Something inside her loosened, slow and uncertain. A single thought rose, quiet as breath. Maybe kindness didn't always ask to be trusted. Sometimes it just waited, patient as snow. She went to her journal again, still open on the table, and added one more line beneath the last. He lives like a man who owes the world nothing, yet still keeps paying. Then she set down the pen and looked out the window once more. Elijah was there, walking back toward the house, his coat brushed white with frost, his hat pulled low. He paused, glanced up just once as if he knew she was watching. Their eyes met through the glass, brief as the flicker of dawn. He nodded nothing more, and in that small gesture, something wordless passed between them. Not peace, not yet. But a beginning, fragile as the light that slipped through the clouds and settled over the valley. The light came gently that morning, thin gold spilling through the frost-laced window, settling across the table where steam curled from a chipped mug. Evelyn stood barefoot on the wooden floor, her breath making small clouds in the cool air. Someone had already been up. The scent of cornmeal lingered, sweet and smoky. On the table sat a plate of cornbread, still warm, a knife resting beside it, and that cup of coffee black, strong, still breathing heat. Outside, she heard the rhythm of an axe splitting wood, slow, steady, like the heartbeat of the valley itself. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, opened the door. The cold rushed in, sharp, biting, but clean. Elijah was near the woodpile, sleeves rolled to the elbow, each swing of his axe deliberate, the blade catching flashes of sunlight. He didn't look up when she stepped outside. Didn't need to. Coffee's still hot, he said. His voice carried easy in the air, low and even. She didn't answer at first, just watched him for a while, the quiet strength of him, the unhurried grace in every movement. There was a rhythm to the way he worked, as if he'd found a kind of peace in repetition. The world around them was waking. Snow dripped from the eaves, the sound of it soft as breath. Somewhere a raven called, its wings black against the sky. Evelyn sat on the porch step, hands wrapped around the mug, letting its warmth seep into her palms. The bitterness of the coffee filled her mouth, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. For the first time since arriving, she felt the ache of the road behind her start to ease. When she looked up, Elijah was stacking the last of the wood. He paused, wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, then pointed toward the fence line where a patch of blue peeked through the snow. Didn't expect to see them this early, he said. Evelyn followed his gaze. At first she thought it was a trick of light, but then she saw them, tiny blooms pushing through the frost, delicate and stubborn. Forget-me-nots. Her throat tightened. Her mother used to plant them by the window each spring, said they were flowers that never forgot kindness, even after a hard winter. Evelyn set down her cup and walked toward the fence, her boots crunching softly in the snow. She knelt, brushed the white powder aside, fingers trembling as they touched the fragile blue petals. "They shouldn't be here yet," she whispered. Elijah leaned against the post beside her, arms folded, eyes on the horizon. "Guess they don't know that," he said quietly. She smiled. "Just barely. My mother loved these. Said they're the kind of flowers that remember even when people don't." He nodded once. Slow. "My ma used to say something like that. Told me to plant the things that made you smile once. Said maybe happiness finds its way back if it's got something familiar to follow." The words lingered between them, soft as snow dust. Evelyn looked up at him. The sunlight caught the faint lines on his face, the pale edge of his scar. There was nothing cruel in it now, just a man who'd learned to live with what he couldn't change. She stood, brushing the snow from her gloves. Did she live here? He nodded toward the house. This was hers. Mine now, I suppose. But most days, still feels like she's just out back, telling me I've stacked the firewood wrong. A hint of laughter flickered in his voice, small but real. Evelyn found herself smiling too, and for a moment the air between them felt lighter, like the first warmth breaking through winter. They walked back toward the porch in silence. Inside, the smell of wood smoke and coffee clung to the air. Elijah poured her another cup, handed it to her without looking directly. She took it, fingers brushing his for the briefest second. The touch was accidental, but it stayed with her longer than it should have. "Thank you," she said. He gave a quiet nod, then sat across from her. You can help yourself to the pantry. Ain't much flour, beans, molasses. If you need something, write it on the paper hanging by the door. I make a supply run once every 2 weeks. Evelyn nodded. I'll manage. The words sounded stronger than she felt. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window. She turned her face toward it, watching how the light caught the flakes drifting past. Every snowflake seemed to glow for an instant before vanishing into the earth. Elijah stood, reached for his coat. I'll check the south fence. Looks like the snow broke part of it. As he opened the door, she said softly, the coffee was good. He stopped, glanced back. Glad you think so. Most folks say it could take the paint off a barn. She laughed, the sound surprising even her. He smiled, really smiled for the first time, and then stepped out into the cold. The laughter faded, but its echo stayed. Evelyn sat for a long while after he'd gone, watching the thin steam rise from her cup. In that small, quiet kitchen, something inside her began to shift like ice loosening on a river, not breaking, just moving. Later, when she went out to hang laundry on the line, she paused again by the fence. The forget-me-nots trembled in the breeze, their color brighter now under the afternoon sun. She knelt, touched them once more. Maybe happiness does remember the way back, she thought. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of cedar and smoke. From somewhere near the barn came the slow rhythm of hammer on wood Elijah, mending what winter had broken. She closed her eyes, let the sound settle deep inside her. It wasn't safety yet, not quite peace, but it was the first morning that didn't hurt to wake into. The morning came gray and heavy, clouds hanging low enough to touch the earth. Evelyn was washing dishes when she heard the first sound hooves dragging through slush. Uneven, slow. She turned, wiped her hands on her apron, and peered through the window. Elijah was crossing the yard. His horse limped beside him, steam rising from its flank. There was something wrong in the way he walked, one hand pressed to his side, the other gripping the reins like he meant to hold himself up with them. By the time he reached the porch, the snow had gone pink where it touched him. Evelyn opened the door before he could reach for the handle. He blinked at her once, eyes squinting against the wind. Just a scrape, he said. But his voice was thinner than usual. She stepped aside. Sit. He hesitated, then nodded, lowering himself into the chair by the fire. The old boards groaned beneath his boots. His coat was torn along the shoulder, dark with blood. Evelyn moved without thinking. She fetched a basin, water sloshing over her hands, and set it on the table beside him. Off with the coat, she said softly. He obeyed, slow and stiff. When the fabric peeled away, she saw at the gash along his upper arm, angry and raw, bleeding through the shirt beneath, and beneath that, older marks, pale scars crossing his back like ropes turned to memory. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "This isn't from today." Elijah looked at her, a faint flicker in his gray eyes. "No," he answered, "not all of it." The wind rattled the windows. Evelyn dipped the cloth into warm water, wrung it out, pressed it gently against his skin. He didn't flinch. His jaw stayed tight, his breath steady. "I was mending the north fence," he said finally. "Barbed wire caught me wrong." She looked up, and the rest? He stared into the fire for a long time before speaking again. His voice was low, rough, like gravel turning underfoot. "Tennessee," he said. 1864. War was damn near over, but folks down there hadn't figured it out yet. Evelyn's hands stilled. "They told us to burn a church," he went on. "Said there were people hiding inside runaways. Colored families. Kids." He swallowed, his throat working against words too old to speak. "I wouldn't do it. My captain gave me one chance to change my mind. I didn't." She could smell the iron in the air, the faint sting of blood. The cloth in her hand trembled, but she didn't stop. "They whipped you," she said quietly. He nodded once. "Left me in the mud 3 days before somebody found me? Didn't die. Guess they figured living was punishment enough. The fire snapped in the grate, sending up a small flare of light. Evelyn kept her eyes on the wound as she cleaned it, careful, slow. When she was done, she reached for the bandage. "Hold still," she murmured. He did. His breathing eased a little as the linen wrapped tight around his arm. When she finished, he looked down at her hands, small, sure, steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "Thank you," he said. She shook her head. "You'd have done the same." Elijah gave a small smile, one corner of his mouth lifting. "Not likely. I can't sew worth a damn." That made her laugh, a soft, startled sound that filled the quiet room like a forgotten melody. For a moment, the years fell away, and it was just two people sitting close to the fire, pretending the world hadn't hurt them both. She handed him his mended sleeve, needle still threaded, then set about stitching the tear in his shirt. The sound of the thread pulling through fabric mixed with the pop of burning wood. Each loop, each knot, felt heavier than it should have, like she was sewing not just cloth, but something torn loose between them. Outside, snow drifted past the window, slow and aimless. When she finished, Elijah flexed his shoulder, testing the seam. "Good as new," he said. Evelyn looked at the neat line she'd made. "Not new," she corrected softly, "just whole again." He watched her then, really watched her. The firelight drew gold from her hair, softened the edges of her face. She looked tired, but strong in a way that didn't ask to be noticed. "You ever seen a battlefield?" he asked. She shook her head. "Don't," he said. "It ain't the fightin' that stays with you. It's the sound after, the quiet. Makes you feel like the world forgot to breathe." Evelyn didn't answer. She threaded the needle once more, just to keep her hands busy, but her chest ached with something she couldn't name. The silence stretched, warm and fragile. When the last flame in the hearth dipped low, she gathered the cloth and bowl, set them aside. Elijah leaned back, eyes half closed, exhaustion pulling at the corners of him. "Get some rest," she whispered. He nodded, though his eyes stayed open. "Don't think I'll sleep much. When it storms, the past comes walking." She hesitated by the door, her hand on the frame. "Then I'll keep the fire lit." He smiled at that barely, but it was enough. That'd help. Later, when he'd finally drifted off in the chair, Evelyn sat by the fire, needle in hand, sewing the last torn seam. The thread gleamed red gold in the glow, her fingers tracing the rhythm of his breath. Outside, the wind had stilled. The valley lay quiet, snow muffling every sound. She tied the final knot, snipped the thread, and laid the shirt beside him. For a moment, she just watched the rise and fall of his chest, the faint line of the scar beneath his collar. Then she wrote, quietly, in her journal, he carries his pain the way other men carry tools, not to show, but to use. She closed the book, set it on her lap, and as the night settled deep around the house, the needle glinted once in the firelight, still warm, still trembling, like a small heartbeat trying to remember how to mend. The snow in town had turned to slush by the time Evelyn stepped off the wagon. The streets of Bitter Creek were lined with weathered signs, their paint half faded by years of wind and dust. She hadn't planned on coming here alone, but Elijah had stayed behind to mend a fence, and she'd told herself she could manage a short trip, just coffee beans, flour, thread, simple things. But towns have a way of remembering faces even when you wish they wouldn't. She pushed open the door to the general store, the bell above her head giving a tired ring. The air inside smelled of leather, sugar, and something faintly metallic. She set her list on the counter, voice soft. 2 pounds of flour, a pound of coffee, and thread. If you have any left. The shopkeeper nodded, busying himself with the order. Evelyn waited, fingers brushing the rim of her basket. When the door opened behind her, another bell, another gust of cold air. She felt it before she turned, a prickle up her spine, like a memory breathing too close. "Well now," a voice drawled from behind her, smooth as oil. Didn't think I'd see the Carter girl all the way out here." Evelyn turned slowly. Jonas Keene. He looked the same, older, maybe, but the smirk hadn't changed. His coat was fine, too fine for a man who worked with his hands, and the gold ring on his finger caught the lamplight when he tipped his hat. Her chest tightened. The smell of smoke flooded back the sound of crackling wood. The night the fire took her home and everyone in it. Her hands began to tremble. Jonas stepped closer, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "You can run as far as you like, sweetheart," he whispered, breath hot with whiskey. "But Ash has a way of sticking to a dress. I can still see it on you." Evelyn froze. The room tilted, her breath gone. She backed away, bumping into a shelf of canned goods that rattled but didn't fall. The shopkeeper turned. "You all right, ma'am?" But she was already moving, pushing through the door, out into the street, the cold air cutting her lungs. The sound of Jonas's laugh followed her, thin and sharp, until it vanished beneath the clatter of the wagon wheels she didn't remember climbing onto. The road home blurred. Snow began again, soft and relentless, covering her tracks as quickly as she made them. By the time she reached the ranch, her hands were raw from clutching the reins. She stumbled through the door, leaving it half open behind her. The room swayed. The scent of smoke, real this time, rose from the fire Elijah had left burning. She fell to her knees on the floor, her breath breaking into small, jagged sounds she couldn't hold back. For a long time, the only thing she could do was cry. Not the polite kind, not the kind she'd been taught to swallow, but the kind that came from somewhere older than fear, something she'd buried too deep for words. Footsteps. Quiet. Measured. Elijah stopped in the doorway, his shadow long across the floorboards. He didn't speak, didn't move closer. After a while, he went to the kitchen, returned with a small tray bread, a cup of broth, a folded cloth. He set it beside her on the floor without a word, then straightened and walked out to the porch. The door closed gently behind him. Outside, she could hear the creak of the chair as he sat down, the soft jingle of his spurs, then nothing. Just silence. The storm thickened as night came down, the wind howling through the birch trees. Evelyn lay curled on the floor, her fingers clutching the edge of the quilt that had fallen from the chair. She could see the tray from where she lay, the steam still rising from the cup. He hadn't waited for her to eat. He'd just made sure she could if she wanted to. Hours passed that way. Sometimes she thought she heard him shift, maybe stand, maybe check the latch. Once, she thought she saw his shadow move across the window, slow, steady. But he never came inside, not until dawn. When she opened her eyes, the storm had passed. Pale light washed across the floor. The tray was still there, but the food was gone cold except for the coffee. It steamed faintly, as if someone had poured it just moments ago. Evelyn pushed herself up, her body aching. The chair on the porch creaked again. She went to the door and opened it a crack. Elijah sat there, coat pulled tight, hat low against the morning glare. His eyes were half closed, but he wasn't asleep. The thermos beside him still held heat. He looked at her once, didn't smile, didn't ask what had happened. "Coffee's fresh," he said simply. Evelyn stepped out, wrapped her shawl tighter. "You stayed out here all night." He shrugged. Didn't seem right to leave the house alone. She looked at him, really looked, the faint circles under his eyes, the stiffness in his shoulders. He'd kept watch, not because he wanted thanks, but because she'd needed quiet more than company. The air between them hung still. She wanted to tell him what had happened in town, about the man with the gold ring and the fire and the words that still burned, but the thought of speaking it out loud felt too heavy to lift. So she just said, "Thank you." He nodded once. "Eat something when you can. Storm's over," but it left cold behind. Then he stood, walked toward the barn, the snow crunching under his boots. Evelyn watched him go, the early light catching on the frost of his coat. When she went back inside, she sat at the table and opened her journal. Her hand shook, but the words came anyway. He didn't ask, didn't need to. Sometimes, Kindness is just not leavin'. She laid the pen down, closed the book. Outside, Elijah's axe struck wood again, steady and sure, and though the sound was small, it felt like the world stitching itself back together, one heartbeat, one breath, one swing at a time. Evelyn heard it before she saw him, the rhythmic strike of wood against nail, echoing faintly through the crisp air. She had gone to fetch water from the well behind the house, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, when she noticed movement past the fence line. The sound came from Edith Moore's place, the small cabin half hidden by the slope, its roof sagging under the weight of another hard winter. Elijah was up there, alone, his horse tied to the post, tools laid out neat in a line beside him. Each swing of his hammer was precise, almost gentle, as though the boards themselves deserved respect. No one had asked him to go. Edith's husband had died 2 years back in a mine accident, leaving her with a son barely old enough to lift a bucket. Most men in Bitter Creek offered her pity, but not their time. Elijah, as usual, hadn't said a word, just loaded his tools and left before breakfast. Evelyn stood watching for a long moment, bucket forgotten at her side. The wind moved through the grass in soft waves, and somewhere beneath it came the muffled sound of a child laughing the boy, handing nails to Elijah, proud to be helping. She didn't walk over, didn't need to. There was something sacred in watching from afar, a quiet kindness that asked for no witness. The hammer paused. Elijah straightened, rolling his shoulders, the morning light sliding across his face. He said something to the boy that made him laugh again. Then, without fanfare, he went back to work. Evelyn turned toward home, her heart heavy in a way she couldn't name. It wasn't sadness, exactly. More like the ache of seeing something good and realizing how rare it truly was. Inside, the fire had burned low. She fed it 2 small logs, watching the sparks catch and rise. The warmth spread slow, like trust. All day she moved through the house in silence, washing, mending, sweeping, yet her thoughts kept circling back to that man on the roof, sleeves rolled to his elbows, helping a widow who hadn't even asked. When Elijah finally returned, dusk had already folded over the valley. His coat was dusted with sawdust, his hands raw, but his eyes were calm. Evelyn met him on the porch, a towel draped over her arm. "You're late," she said softly. He shrugged. "Roof was worse than I thought. She's got a young boy, couldn't leave it half done." She nodded. "Did she thank you?" Elijah looked down, almost embarrassed. "Didn't need to. Roof's dry. That's thanks enough." He walked past her then, into the house, the scent of cedar clinging to him. Evelyn watched the door close, the faintest smile touching her lips. Later, while he ate, she sat across from him at the table, mending the hem of her skirt. The only sound was the soft scrape of his spoon against the bowl. When he finished, he said, "Saw the sheriff in town last week. Jonas Keene's heading north. Won't be back this way soon." Evelyn's hand stopped mid-stitch. "You knew?" He nodded. "Didn't need to ask what happened. You came back looking like someone who'd seen a ghost." A long silence followed. The fire cracked in the hearth, and the smell of smoke drifted between them. "Thank you," she said. He lifted his eyes to hers. "For what? For not asking?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, gaze steady. "Some things don't need to be dug up to be known." Evelyn looked down at her hands, thread pulled taut between her fingers. The air between them was quiet, but full like the stillness before rain. That night, after he'd gone out to check the horses, she took her journal from the shelf and sat by the fire. The pages had grown soft from use. The ink faded in places where her tears had touched them. She dipped the pen, hesitated, then wrote slowly, "Today I saw a man do right with no eyes upon him. Maybe that's what grace looks like, work done in silence. Not for forgiveness, but because it's the only way he knows how to be." She paused, listening to the wind press against the windows. "Perhaps I'm not afraid to be loved anymore. Perhaps love isn't what I thought. Maybe it's just someone fixing a roof that isn't theirs, making sure no one sleeps cold." Her hand trembled when she set the pen down. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers that glowed like stars fallen to the earth. Outside, Elijah's footsteps crossed the porch, then stopped. For a moment, the world was perfectly still, just the creak of the boards, the whisper of the wind. Evelyn didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew he'd linger there, making sure the latch caught, that the house was safe before he went to bed. She blew out the lamp, the room sinking into soft dark. The last thing she saw was the glow of the coals and the outline of the man who kept them burning, wordless and steadfast. The lamp on the table burned low, a single pool of gold light spilling over the wooden boards. Evelyn had gone to bed early, her footsteps soft against the hallway floor, leaving her journal open beside the chair where she'd been writing. Elijah hadn't meant to see it. He'd come in only to add a log to the fire before turning in himself. But the edge of that leather-bound book caught his eye, the faint curve of her handwriting curling across the page, the ink still glistening. He stood there for a moment, unsure. Then the wind rattled the shutters, and the lamplight flickered just enough for him to make out the words. I don't need him. I just need to forget. The sentence hit harder than it should have, short, simple. But it felt like someone had taken the air out of the room. Elijah closed the book, careful, gentle. His rough fingers lingered on the worn leather cover. He could still smell her ink, the faint scent of lavender oil she used to soften the pages. Then he blew out the lamp and went to his room. He didn't sleep. The hours stretched long, broken only by the hiss of wind through the birch trees. He lay on his back, staring at the dark ceiling, hearing her words again and again. I don't need him. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that she'd earned the right to her pain, and maybe he was part of what she needed to leave behind. But something in him twisted all the same. In the morning, the world looked the same, but quieter. Elijah was up before dawn, as always. He fed the horses, checked the water trough, split wood until his hands ached. When he came inside, Evelyn was already at the table, a cup of coffee warming her palms. He nodded, "Mornin'." She looked up, smiled faintly. "Mornin'." That was all. He didn't ask if she'd slept well, didn't offer bread or pour her cup like he usually did. Just took his own coffee and sat across from her, the silence between them heavier than the winter air. She noticed. Of course she did. There was a small change in the way he moved, the way he didn't meet her eyes for long. It wasn't anger. Elijah Ward didn't seem the kind of man who let anger speak for him. It was something quieter, harder. That night, he didn't knock on her door to say sleep well like he always did before turning in. Didn't ask if she needed another blanket or if the wind was too loud. Just walked past her room and let the floorboards creak their way to silence. Evelyn lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling a hollow she hadn't known could ache so sharply. She didn't know what had changed, only that something had gone missing, something she hadn't realized she'd been counting on. When morning came, the valley was wrapped in fog. She rose early, made coffee, and set the pot where he'd see it first thing. Then she sat down with her journal again, heart heavy. The page from the night before still stared back at her, its ink dry and final. She read it once, then again, and for the first time, she saw it not as something she'd confessed, but something she'd tried to believe. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. Slowly, she wrote beneath the last line, "But now I see him, and I'm afraid he'll stop waiting for me to catch up to loving him." The sound of boots on the porch made her stop. Elijah stepped inside, hat in hand, a dusting of frost on his shoulders. He nodded toward the coffee. "You made it early today." She smiled, small and tired. "You've been up before the sun lately." He grunted softly, poured himself a cup, sat down. The table between them was the same as it had always been, worn smooth in the middle, one leg shorter than the rest, but something invisible now bridged that space, a quiet that wasn't comfortable anymore. She wanted to speak, to tell him she'd left words on the page that didn't belong there anymore. But he looked so steady, so far away, even when he sat right in front of her, that she couldn't find where to begin. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the line of the mountains beyond the valley. The light came thin and pale through the window, striking the steam that rose from his cup. Elijah finally said, "You write a lot." She blinked. "It helps me think." He nodded, though his gaze stayed fixed on his hands. Sometimes words say more than they mean to. The tone wasn't sharp, but it carried weight. Evelyn's chest tightened. She wanted to ask him what he'd read, but that would be admitting it was true. So instead, she said nothing. The rest of the day passed like a shadow. He worked outside, she inside, their paths crossing but never touching. When evening fell, Elijah came in, hung his coat, and went straight to his room. The lamp burned low again. Evelyn sat by it, the journal open before her. She stared at what she'd written that morning, read it one last time, then closed the cover and pressed it to her chest. For the first time, she prayed not for forgiveness, but for courage. Later, when she heard his boots cross the floorboards toward his room, she almost called his name, but the words caught on her tongue, too soft to rise above the silence. In the stillness that followed, she thought of his hands, how they'd trembled once under hers when she'd cleaned his wound, how careful he'd been to never touch her without reason. And she thought, what if he never does again? Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the birch branches like fingers through hair. She leaned her head on the windowpane, watching the moonlight stretch across the snow. Inside the quiet, her heart beat once, slow and sure. It wasn't love yet, not the kind she could name, but it was something close, a longing to be seen, to be forgiven, to reach for the hand that had never stopped being there. By the time Evelyn noticed the smoke, the sky had already begun to glow. It wasn't the calm gold of sunset, but the fierce, trembling orange of something hungry. The barn was burning. She dropped the bucket she'd been carrying. Water splashed over her skirt, hissed on the dry ground. For a breath. She couldn't move, only watch as the flames climbed the boards, leaping from hay to beam, devouring the wood with a roar that felt alive. Then she ran. Elijah. His name tore from her throat, thin against the wind. He was already there, half silhouetted in the blaze, pulling at the stall doors, shouting at the horses to move. The air rippled with heat. Sparks rained down like stars gone wrong. Evelyn stumbled toward him, but the heat shoved her back. He disappeared inside the barn, swallowed by smoke. She screamed his name again, but the fire answered first, a crash of timber, the hiss of something collapsing. She turned, eyes streaming, and saw the house. The door hung open, the curtains lifting with the wind. And suddenly, she remembered the small leather book he kept locked in the drawer of his desk, the one she'd only glimpsed once, when he thought she wasn't looking. Elijah's past lived in that book, his war, his scars, everything he'd never spoken aloud. Before she could think, she was running again, toward the house. The world blurred. Heat licked her skin even from across the yard. Inside, the smoke was thinner, but the air felt thick alive with the sound of crackling walls. She coughed, pressed her sleeve over her mouth, and stumbled toward the desk. The drawer stuck, warped from heat. She pulled harder, coughing, gasping. The wood gave with a splintering snap. The journal fell into her hands dark brown. Edges burned with time. She clutched it to her chest. Then the sound came, a deep, hollow crack. The ceiling beam gave way. She didn't remember falling, only the sudden cold rush of air when someone's arms caught her, pulled her clear. The world outside was chaos, flames curling around the doorway, smoke chasing them into the open air. Elijah's voice came through, ragged but steady. "Got you?" Her knees gave out, but he held her upright. His face was streaked with ash, eyes wild, coughing hard. "I told you to stay back," he rasped. She lifted the book between them, her voice barely a whisper. "You left it." He looked at it, then at her like he couldn't decide which to reach for first. "It's just a damn book. Evelyn." "No," she said, her voice breaking. "It's you. The part you keep locked away, the part that still hurts." Something inside him faltered. For once, there was no defense, no hard edge in his tone, just exhaustion. The barn let out a final groan as the roof gave in. The horses were safe now, scattered beyond the fence, their cries distant. Ash drifted down around them like snow. Elijah sank to his knees, pulling her with him. The world was all gray and orange and noise. "Why would you risk yourself for that?" he said hoarsely, nodding to the book. Evelyn pressed it tighter against her chest. "Because I've seen what happens when people let their pain burn. It takes everything else with it." He looked at her for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached out and rested a hand over hers, the leather of the book warm beneath their palms. The fire's light softened, flickering low as the wind began to turn. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying pieces of the night away. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, her breath trembling. "You can't keep fighting ghosts forever, Elijah." He let out a low laugh that wasn't really laughter. "Maybe not, but they sure as hell keep finding me." She smiled through her tears. "Then maybe it's time you stopped running and let one of them sit beside you." He said nothing, but the hand still covering hers tightened, rough and sure. The flames dimmed as the last of the barn fell to embers. The mountain air turned cool again, brushing against their soot-streaked faces. They stayed like that for a while, two figures outlined by ruin, holding something between them that had almost been lost. When Elijah finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "That book's got things no one ought to read. I already have," she said softly. "In your eyes." A pause. Then, for the first time in months, he let his head rest lightly against hers. The weight of silence between them was no longer heavy, it was shared. The valley was quiet now, save for the faint hiss of dying fire. Somewhere, the wind carried the scent of rain. Evelyn lifted her face. "Do you hear that?" He nodded. "Storm's comin'." "No," she said. "It's passing." He turned to her then, and for the first time, his gaze didn't hold the past, it held her. In that still, glowing ruin, surrounded by ashes and half-burned boards, they sat together, breathing. When dawn came, the fire was out. Smoke curled low over the field, and the frost returned to the grass, faint and glimmering. Evelyn opened her hand. The leather book lay there, scorched but whole. She brushed the soot from its cover, then placed it in his lap. He looked down at it for a long time, then up at her. "Guess you saved me," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No, Elijah, I just stopped you from forgetting you were worth saving." The first light touched their faces, soft as forgiveness. He reached up, brushed the ash from her hair. His thumb lingered just a moment too long, and then, without a word, he drew her close not with fire, but with the kind of warmth that stays long after. The valley had changed. Snowmelt ran in thin silver streams along the fence posts, gathering in shallow pools where the horses came to drink. The air was softer, almost forgiving. Even the mountains seemed less severe, their white crowns giving way to green. Evelyn knelt in the garden that morning, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands sunk deep in the dark earth. The ground was cold, but alive. Beneath her palms, roots stirred, tiny threads of life pushing upward. She pressed a handful of forget-me-not seeds into the soil, covering them gently with her fingertips. The same patch where she'd found them that first winter, pale blue against snow. Only this time, they weren't ghosts from the past. They were promises, behind her. The house stood with its doors open wide, breathing in the new season. The smell of coffee drifted out, mixed with sawdust and spring wind. Somewhere beyond the barn, Elijah's hammer struck wood steady. Even, he was rebuilding what the fire had taken, beam by beam, board by board. Evelyn looked up now and then, watching him from a distance. His shirt was white today, sleeves rolled, sun turning the scar at his jaw to silver. He moved slower than before, careful with his shoulder, but his strength seemed different, rooted, not restless. The birds returned first, then the warmth, then the courage. When she finished planting, she sat back on her heels and brushed the dirt from her hands. The birch tree behind the house had begun to wake. Tiny green buds trembled at its tips, catching the light. She reached out, fingers grazing the bark where the winter fire had left a blackened scar. From that same trunk, Elijah had cut a small piece of wood weeks ago, said he'd make something from it. She hadn't asked what. That afternoon, clouds gathered but never broke. The sun lay low over the hills, staining everything gold. Elijah came in from the field, quiet as always. But there was something different about the way he carried himself, like a man walking towards something he'd already made peace with. He washed his hands at the basin, water dark with dust, then dried them on his sleeve. "Looks like those flowers'll take root," he said, nodding toward the patch by the fence. Evelyn smiled. "If they're stubborn enough." He chuckled low. "They remind me of someone." She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It was warm, alive, almost shy. Elijah reached into his pocket. "I've been working on something," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, not with strain, but with feeling he couldn't quite smooth out. He opened his palm, a ring simple, carved from birch wood, pale, with a faint spiral of grain that caught the light like the pattern of wind over snow. He turned it once between his fingers, came from the tree out back. "Thought it might mean something if it stayed close to where we started." Evelyn's breath caught. The memory of that winter came back in small pieces, the cold, the silence, the fear she'd carried like a second skin, and him steady, wordless, never asking for more than she could give. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her hands. "When you came here," he said slowly. "It was a contract, paper and ink, two people needing to survive something bigger than themselves." The air between them trembled. "But it don't feel like that anymore," he continued. "Not to me." She couldn't look away. Elijah took a slow breath. "So, I figured I'd ask again this time, without a letter or a promise made to strangers. Just between us." He held out the ring. "Do you want to stay? Not 'cause you have to, not 'cause the world pushed you here, but because maybe it's home now." The wind lifted, stirring her hair. For a moment, the world felt still. No ghosts, no fire, no distance left to cross. Evelyn swallowed hard. "When I first came," she whispered, "I thought love was something loud, something that burned." He said nothing, only waited. "But you," her voice trembled, "you taught me it's the quiet things that last, the way you fix a roof, or leave coffee by the fire, the way you stay." She reached out, her hand finding his. "Yes," she said softly, "because of you. Because I don't want to forget what it feels like to belong." His breath left him in a low exhale, half laughter, half disbelief. The corner of his mouth lifted as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, smooth against her skin. They stood there in the doorway, sunlight breaking through the clouds, falling in soft bars across the floor. Neither spoke. There was no need. The sound of the wind through the birch leaves said enough. After a while, Elijah brushed his thumb over her knuckles, then looked toward the field. "Guess spring came after all," he murmured. Evelyn smiled through tears she didn't try to hide. "It always does. Just takes its time." He reached out, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for a breath longer than necessary. In the yard, the first forget-me-nots had begun to bloom, tiny, blue, defiant. The world wasn't perfect. The scars still marked the barn's frame, and the earth still smelled faintly of ash when the wind turned the right way. But life had come back, quietly, faithfully. That evening, when the sun sank behind the hills, Elijah lit a small fire on the porch. They sat side by side, mugs in hand, watching the light fade. No vows, no grand words, only the warmth between them, steady as the glow on their faces. When the last of the light slipped away, Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you think the past ever lets go?" she asked. Elijah looked at the horizon, where dusk met the stars. "Maybe not," he said softly. "But I reckon it can learn to sit still if you let it." She smiled at that, then closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of his breath, the creak of the porch boards, the gentle hum of life coming back to Bitter Creek. The valley had softened. The wind no longer carried the bite of winter, only the scent of damp earth and pine sap. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a river broke free from its ice, its murmur folding into the silence like a promise kept. Evelyn stood barefoot in the grass, the ground cool, alive beneath her feet. Her dress brushed the dew, its hem dark with it. Above, the birch leaves shimmered, new and trembling like small, brave hearts learning to beat again. Elijah was close, the kind of close that didn't ask for permission. He still smelled faintly of cedar smoke and rain, the scent of someone who'd worked too hard, too long, and finally learned to stop running. His shirt was white, sleeves rolled, and in his rough hands lay the little ring he had carved from the tree behind their home. He took her hand, turning it palm up. The wood was smooth, pale, warm from the heat of his skin. "When you came here," he said softly, "I thought maybe the world was giving me one last test, to see if I could keep something fragile without breaking it." Evelyn smiled, eyes wet but steady. "And did you?" He looked down at her fingers, the small tremor in them. "I don't reckon I kept you," he murmured. "We just stayed." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been waiting there all along. She laughed, a sound that startled even her small, bright, like glass catching sun. Then she whispered, "There's no music." Elijah looked around at the birch leaves rustling overhead, the river murmuring beyond the fence, the steady thud of his heart. He smiled. "There is," he said. "You just have to listen." And so they did. No steps, no rhythm to follow, just movement born from the quiet. The earth was soft beneath them, giving way under their feet as they turned, slow and sure. Her hair brushed his jaw. His hand found the small of her back. Somewhere, a bird startled and took flight. The world didn't fade. It folded inward until there was nothing but the sound of grass bending and breath mingling. He whispered something, then she didn't quite catch it. Something about time, about how it had all been worth the wait. She didn't ask him to repeat it. Some words are meant to be felt, not heard. They swayed until the light began to turn honey-colored. The sun slipped between the branches, laying stripes of gold across their shoulders. Evelyn closed her eyes. In the hush, she remembered the woman who had stepped off that carriage months ago, hands trembling, heart walled up in fear, carrying more ghosts than hope. That woman was gone. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she had simply found a place to rest. Elijah's fingers brushed her cheek, tracing the line where tears had once fallen freely. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. A gust came through then, playful, lifting the hem of her dress, scattering petals across the grass. The sound of their laughter soft. Surprised rose up with it. For the first time, it didn't echo against emptiness. It lingered. The evening crept in, slow as a breath drawn before sleep. Shadows stretched across the field. The first star appeared above the ridge, faint, but there. Elijah reached for her again, slower now, his thumb tracing circles over her hand. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. Evelyn shook her head. "Not anymore." He nodded, as if that answer had been waiting a long time. Then he let out a low, contented sigh. "Guess Bitter Creek's finally got its spring." They stood like that for a while, two figures in the soft dark, surrounded by the hum of things returning to life. When the chill came, he fetched her shawl, draped it over her shoulders. She turned, pressed her forehead against his chest. His heart thudded steady. The rhythm she'd once feared and now trusted more than words. Somewhere in the house, the fire crackled, a quiet reminder that warmth could be made, not just found. She looked up at him then, and in the dim light, saw every year of his loneliness reflected back not as burden, but as proof. Proof that sometimes it takes a lifetime to learn gentleness. He bent, kissed her forehead. "You're home," he said. It wasn't a declaration. It was a truth that had already settled between them, like dust in sunlight. She smiled, small, tired, real. We both are. The night deepened. The birch leaves whispered one last time. They turned toward the house, their steps leaving faint prints in the wet grass, the smell of spring clinging to their clothes. At the door, Evelyn paused, looking back once more at the field, the river, the smoke curling from the chimney, every piece of her life, the pain, the fire, the quiet mornings seemed to hum together, not in sorrow, but in peace. She reached for Elijah's hand, fingers lacing through his. Elijah? He stopped, looking down at her. She hesitated, then said the words she'd carried all this time, the ones she hadn't dared to believe in. I'm not afraid anymore. He nodded once, slow, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. Good, he whispered. Neither am I. They stepped inside. The door closed softly behind them, but the world outside kept moving, the river, the trees, the wind carrying the faint sound of their laughter into the dark. For a long while after, the valley of Bitter Creek stayed quiet, the kind of quiet that holds something sacred, the quiet of healing, of love that doesn't need to prove itself anymore. In the quiet rhythm of Evelyn and Elijah's story lies a truth that time itself seems to whisper. Healing doesn't come with thunder or grand gestures. It arrives softly, like spring after a long winter, asking only for patience and gentleness. Both had been broken by their pasts, scarred by choices, loss, and silence. Yet, through small acts, a cup of coffee left by the fire, a hand that did not demand, a word spoken at the right moment, they learned what love truly is: not possession, but presence. For those of us who have lived long enough to know how heavy life can be, this story reminds us that peace is not found in forgetting what hurt us, but in allowing tenderness to grow beside it. We are never too old to start again, never too worn to let kindness mend what pride once kept closed: love, forgiveness, and quiet courage. These are not the luxuries of youth, but the gifts of a heart that has learned how to listen. And sometimes, that is all we are asked to do: listen, stay, and let the warmth return. Thank you for sitting by the fire with us tonight, and for letting this old Western story find a place in your heart. If the tale of Evelyn and Elijah touched you even just a little, we'd be grateful if you'd leave a like, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Every click, every kind word helps us keep these forgotten stories alive, one gentle heartbeat at a time. Until next time, keep your coffee warm, your heart open, and may the wind always carry you home.